Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Bells. I'm a graduate of the International Studies in Vernacular Architecture program at Oxford Brookes University. I hold a PhD in geography, and I work in the Integrative and Global Studies department at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in the US. I'm here today to talk to you about cultural geography in our first module of that unit, focused on how cultural geography has explored the vernacular house. My goal in this lecture is to help you gain an understanding of the discipline of cultural geography in relation to the study of vernacular architecture, and to understand how the house has been studied over time in that discipline, and also where the study of the vernacular house has landed across disciplines. Paul Oliver and others have stated that studies investigating vernacular architecture are at the convergence of several disciplines, including architecture, art history, geography, and anthropology. I'll be sharing geographic studies of the vernacular house, primarily American, but because of the interdisciplinarity of vernacular architecture studies, I'll also discuss work of scholars from other disciplines, such as architecture and planning, to highlight a geographic approach to studying the house. First, I'd like to define geography for you. Geographers study the way that phenomena exist across space, and they study the way places change in relation to certain influences, including migration, population change, climate change, or economics. Geographic studies can focus on urban or rural regions. They can look at development or even human behavior, or physical characteristics of the earth. Almost anything can be studied with a geographic lens and would normally assess how something has dispersed spatially or how it leaves an imprint on the landscape. The house has been a mainstay of study in cultural geography for over 100 years. American landscape scholar J.B. Jackson declared study of the dwelling as the most important task of the human geographer. Jackson considered the dwelling to be the elementary unit on the landscape and by far the most significant man-made feature on it. Jackson said it's the key to understanding all other elements on the landscape, including culture and social order. Other geographers have called the house the central reference point of human existence, a social product, and a cultural institution. Vernacular houses show great repetition in design, particularly in traditional and remote settings, where value is placed on homogeneity, and group identity is more important than individual distinction. The traditional uniformity in house type creates a sense of belonging to a community, and in that way, it's critical for cultural identity. Before the 1960s, much of human geography was devoted to describing the differences between places, areas, and regions. Known as the chorographic approach seen in these maps, the goal was a complete understanding of the Earth's surface represented regionally through particular phenomena, which could be the house or dress, religion, or politics. Early styles of cultural geography in America in the 1930s and 1940s saw that the greatest potential contribution of the house was in distinguishing cultural regions by house type to describe where a certain style and a culture spread, leading to a long history of diffusionist studies, or works that study house type limited by and focused primarily on region. The well-known work of Fred Kniffen exemplified the early stage that delimited a regional house type with no added understanding of the reasons for its being or the culture that used it. His work described the important characteristics of Louisiana house types and demonstrated that the house is an element worthy of study in and of itself, but portrayed the house as isolated from the people who use it. The thinking is that the study of vernacular architecture was inhibited through these early decades of study and work that has been criticized as overly descriptive, lacking connection to culture or the future, and disregarding the concept of change. But documentation is important. We shouldn't necessarily abandon description and detailed documentation because it has provided important evidence of styles that no longer exist. But study should also include stronger analytical backing. We should be addressing questions in our studies. A lot of later work in the 70s still focused on a defined area, which predominantly included the rural landscape. But it put increasing emphasis on society and the cultural landscape, which is a critical term in cultural geography. It's often interchangeable with vernacular landscape, which depicts the regional, everyday nature of a landscape, but with some emphasis on the collection of features. You can see from the titles Townscape and Mexican Border Cities that the emphasis went beyond just the house. Also, a focus on change and urban environments and complexities of class were increasingly common. A well-known detailed study in the American Mormon vernacular landscape determined that significant landscape features that define the cultural region and help identify Mormon settlements based on home style, style of agricultural buildings and tools, and town layout and features such as open irrigation ditches. It made the point that a town doesn't have to have every one of these features in repetition, but it's more likely to be a Mormon town with increased occurrences of these landscape features. Features that can also be found in non-Mormon towns. Geographers began to acknowledge that dwellings are tangible cultural forms, and their strengths as subjects of study goes much beyond just their location. This work helped lay the path for the study of whole landscapes and an emphasis on a set of features. The study moved towards a focus on landscape analysis, distinctive features, and social groups, or society rather than regions. So it could look at fences and vegetation, wood storage practices that are particular to a certain group. These all became important components for understanding the people who lived in a house and its function. Many architectural changes that take place are opportunities for observation on the small scale, meaning railings, fences, window trim, painting patterns, yard ornamentation. This is often the scale that cultural geographers could focus on. When changes take place on the large scale, to the house form, the major construction materials, the scale of the house, these changes tend to have a much larger effect on the landscape and on place change. Since geographers study how and why places change, the large-scale changes to the house are meaningful indicators of cultural change. Amos Rappaport, who was not a geographer, but he's central in the study of vernacular architecture, described the house as a fixed feature element. Fixed features change slowly or rarely due to their size. Because houses in traditional societies are commonly owner-built and owner-controlled, they're more culturally specific and less arbitrary. Therefore, the vernacular fabric is highly identifiable and often changes greatly between regions that have different identities. Geographers began to study the process of adaptation in the house and also looked farther to understand the underlying social change that was being reflected, arguing that major change in the look of a cultural landscape very likely reflects a major change occurring in the nation. or at least the regional culture. On the left in this image, you see a wooden vernacular house in Himachal Pradesh, India. It's next to a contemporary version of a house that has very little indication of place. You can barely see the roof trim. There's detail along the edge of the eaves that's similar to the historic house. The singular detail that tries to tie it to its place. And we'll look more at this type of architecture in our next lecture. On the right, you see a current day, very arbitrary set of houses in the United States. They're not owner built. They're not representative of any region or culture. They're developed by a company without concern for the people or place, and could be in any region. When changes take place at this level, on the large scale to the house form, the only option left for showing identity is transferred to the small scale level of ornamentation. It's become clear that studies have to incorporate how houses change and how they blend with migration or globalization. Scholars show that connections to architecture are reinforced through collective processes of change so that houses meet the needs of a new culture and stay viable for future generations. Several scholars argue that features maintain meaning or become more meaningful because they changed and because they retained a function. When features are transferable enough and work within new accepted norms, the trait is more likely to expand, especially if it's small scale and adaptable. On the left in these images, you see a historic window transom carving. It's in the Caribbean, and it's common on many houses. In the middle is a modernized glass etching that tries to convey the same small-scale detail of this transom, even with a completely different material. The building is a large-scale condo. The form is completely different from the vernacular house, but the small-scale feature helps maintain a connection to the place and to the history. The black and white image here is from Kingston Heath's Patina of Place. You see a metal railing in the front yard and on the upper porch. He's showing that the new Portuguese immigrants to Massachusetts changed the common wooden railing to better represent what they know from their homeland, changing the vernacular and showing their identity through this small-scale feature, which was adaptable to a ready-made house that didn't represent their history. Oftentimes, processes of adapting the house on the small scale ensures that it will continue to reflect the identity of the inhabitants. If features are not easily transferable or don't retain a function for the new generation, they're likely to disappear. One of the major findings that emerged in cultural geography was the process of simplifying trait complexes or sets of features of the house in order to cope with stress. Stresses can be brought on by habitat or climate change, changing cultural norms, loss of access to materials such as wood, and changes brought on by migration. This results in changes to pre-existing vernacular. These are images of houses around Sangla in Kinnaur district of Himachal Pradesh, India. You can see the earliest house on the left has detailed carving, which is slowly lost through the years of house change. There's also an overhang of the upper floor, which later deepened to a ground floor porch. And in more contemporary construction, the porch is enclosed into living space as needs have changed. The house is certainly different now, but the story of the changes is also very interesting and tells a lot about the people who live there. Part of the problem with early vernacular architecture studies is that it studied the vernacular house as if no conflict has surrounded the choices and alternatives of the house. In fact, choices are made continually, and the house is adapted and modernized. And hybrid studies are valuable if we're also trying to capture the story of the society along with the description of the house. What's called for now in cultural geography and in vernacular architecture studies is a conscious focus on the modifications to vernacular designs and adaptations to new circumstances. The idea of timelessness is the paradigm that holds vernacular landscape back into a stigmatized perspective where house forms and landscapes are relegated to the past and inconsequential for the future if people think that they can't adapt and can't be lived in contemporarily. Blending, weathering, creolization, hybridity, fusion, and vernacularization are all terms that appear repeatedly in contemporary writings and refer to new, locally chosen forms created through modification. Through adaptation, and by embracing new representations that appeal to younger generations, the connection to vernacular traditions will be maintained by the people who value them. Now that we've talked about what to look for in the landscape, I want to circle back around to why we should care about the cultural landscape holistically. In cultural geography, there's an emphasis on how much the house is embedded in the larger landscape. In the world of architecture, everyday landscapes are generally undervalued because of the emphasis on great monuments, archaeological sites, the preservation of select grand buildings. Surrounding villages often face demolition or neglect. The book Managing Cultural Landscapes challenges this established framework and is worth pointing out for its focus on living landscapes, including ordinary, rural, and urban settings. It articulates a practice or an approach to management and development. Embedded in this framework is the maintenance of traditional skills and knowledge, a respect for landscape change, and involvement of local people in all stages of planning, execution, and management. The contributors consider this paradigm shift in the way we approach landscapes in preservation planning and call for increased consideration of landscape components and conscious decision-making on what the landscape can be. And so preserving isolated buildings may not have the same long-term effect as making sure a full living landscape is available for people. Geographers have a long history of studying the house as a central element in the landscape. Scholars make it clear that vernacular architecture is a central process, a vital aspect of researching cultural norms, boundaries, and identity. Houses are fixed features that change slowly. When they change on the large scale, they create great changes in the vernacular landscape. But small-scale features and ornamentation allow great opportunities for groups to maintain a connection to vernacular traditions, even amid stressors and the need for change. Because settlements have always evolved and will continue to do so, we can expect that many vernacular features will be modified as contexts, ideals, and values change. This represents an opportunity to critically analyze the process of change in the vernacular home and what it means for and about the place and the people. Remembering to look at the full landscape as a sum that is greater than its parts is a beneficial way to approach the study of vernacular buildings and settings. And we'll look more at change in the next lecture, providing here a list of some references of geographers that focus on landscape change and changes to specific houses. Thanks.